My dear wife, kamikaze planes are heading straight for our ship. I don't know if I'll have time to finish writing this letter. These desperate words were scrawled in pencil by 26-year-old Navy machinist Mark Sullivan aboard the USS Franklin on March 19, 1945, as Japanese suicide bombers dove toward his aircraft carrier off the coast of Japan. His hands trembled not from fear alone, but from the violent shaking of the ship's hull as bombs exploded around him in the ammunition storage compartments deep below deck. Every second could be his last, yet Mark felt compelled to leave these final words for the woman he had married just 8 months before shipping out to the Pacific theater. Mark's letter was discovered in 1963 during the decommissioning of the USS Franklin, tucked inside a waterproof pouch hidden behind a pipe junction in the ship's magazine compartments. The 3-page letter, written on Navy stationery and stained with oil and blood, provided historians with the most intimate first-person account of what it felt like to be inside an American warship under kamikaze attack during the final desperate months of World War II. What made Mark's testimony particularly valuable was the technical precision with which he described the damage control procedures and the human cost of Japan's Divine Wind campaign against Task Force 58, the most powerful naval armada ever assembled. If these forgotten stories of American sailors who faced the ultimate test of courage against an enemy willing to die for victory fascinate you, make sure to subscribe to our channel because we're bringing you the most powerful testimonies from the Pacific War that history has nearly forgotten. Mark Sullivan had been serving aboard the USS Franklin since her commissioning in January 1944, working as a machinist's mate in the engine rooms and damage control parties that kept the massive aircraft carrier operational during the most intense naval combat of the Pacific War. The Franklin, nicknamed Big Ben by her crew, was one of the newest and most advanced carriers in the American fleet, capable of launching over 90 aircraft and equipped with the latest radar and anti-aircraft systems designed to defend against conventional air attacks. What neither Mark nor his shipmates could have anticipated was that they would face an entirely new form of warfare that turned enemy aircraft into guided missiles, piloted by men who had already accepted death as the price of striking back at American naval power. The kamikaze attacks that Mark would witness and survive were the desperate final strategy of an Imperial Japanese Navy that had lost most of its experienced pilots and conventional aircraft to American industrial superiority and combat attrition. Beginning in October 1944, Japanese commanders began organizing systematic suicide attacks using whatever planes and pilots they could scrape together, reasoning that one aircraft flown by a determined pilot willing to die could inflict more damage than 10 planes flown by inexperienced aviators trying to survive conventional combat missions. The psychological impact on American sailors would prove almost as devastating as the physical destruction, as men like Mark discovered that their enemy had crossed a line that challenged everything they understood about warfare and human nature. Mark Sullivan grew up in a working-class Irish neighborhood in South Boston, where his father had worked as a longshoreman and his mother raised 4 children while taking in laundry to help make ends meet during the Great Depression. The Navy had represented Mark's ticket to a better life, offering technical training and steady pay that seemed like a fortune compared to the unemployment lines and bread kitchens that had defined his teenage years. His letters home during basic training and technical school revealed a young man who took pride in mastering the complex machinery that powered America's newest warships, describing in detail the massive turbines, reduction gears, and electrical systems that he would be responsible for maintaining during combat operations. Mark had met his wife, Catherine, at a USO dance in Boston just before shipping out for advanced training in Norfolk, Virginia. Their courtship had been conducted largely through letters as Mark prepared for deployment to the Pacific, but the connection between them had been strong enough to support a quick wartime marriage during his final leave before joining the Franklin's crew. Catherine worked as a riveter in a defense plant building destroyers, and her letters to Mark were filled with news from the home front and expressions of pride in the contribution they were both making to the war effort. She had no way of knowing that her husband would soon face combat experiences that would challenge his fundamental assumptions about human nature and the moral boundaries of warfare. The USS Franklin that Mark joined in early 1944 was a floating city of nearly 3,000 officers and enlisted men representing the pinnacle of American naval engineering and industrial capacity. The ship displaced over 27,000 tons, stretched nearly 900 feet from bow to stern, and could launch aircraft every 30 seconds during intensive flight operations. Mark's battle station was in the forward magazine compartments, where he was responsible for maintaining the elevators and conveyor systems that moved ammunition from storage areas to the gun positions that defended the ship against air attack. It was dangerous work under the best of circumstances, surrounded by enough explosives to sink the ship if they detonated accidentally. But it was also crucial to the survival of every man aboard during the increasingly desperate air battles that characterized the final phase of the Pacific War. During the Franklin's first combat deployment in 1944, Mark had experienced conventional Japanese air attacks during operations in the Philippines and Formosa, but these had been relatively predictable affairs where enemy pilots attempted to bomb or torpedo American ships while preserving their own lives for future missions. Mark wrote about the professional satisfaction of watching American fighter pilots and anti-aircraft gunners drive off these attacks with minimal damage to Task Force 58, noting that Japanese aviation seemed to be declining in both quality and quantity as the war progressed. What he couldn't have anticipated was that this apparent weakness would soon transform into a different kind of strength, as Japanese commanders embraced tactics that American military doctrine had never seriously considered. The first rumors of suicide attacks reached the Franklin's crew in late 1944, but most sailors dismissed them as enemy propaganda designed to demoralize American forces through exaggerated claims about Japanese fanaticism and determination. Mark wrote to his wife that the stories seemed too incredible to believe, noting that no rational military force would deliberately sacrifice trained pilots and aircraft in attacks that could only be carried out once. The idea that enemy aviators would intentionally crash their planes into American ships struck him as not just militarily unsound, but fundamentally inhuman, a violation of the basic survival instinct that all combatants shared regardless of their nationality or political beliefs. Have you ever wondered how American sailors psychologically prepared themselves to face an enemy that had completely abandoned the normal rules of warfare and embraced death as a weapon of war? The reality of kamikaze warfare struck Task Force 58 with devastating force during the invasion of the Philippines in October 1944. When Japanese pilots began systematically crashing their aircraft into American warships in coordinated attacks that combined tactical surprise with psychological terror. Mark's first encounter with suicide tactics came during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, when a damaged Japanese bomber suddenly changed course from what appeared to be a retreat and dove straight into the flight deck of a nearby escort carrier. The explosion that followed was unlike anything Mark had witnessed during conventional air attacks, as the enemy aircraft's fuel and remaining bombs combined with the carrier's own aviation gasoline to create a fireball that consumed the entire forward section of the ship within minutes. Mark's initial reaction, recorded in a letter to his wife written 3 days after the attack, revealed the shock and confusion that suicide tactics created among American naval personnel who had been trained to expect rational behavior from their enemies. He wrote about watching the Japanese pilot's final approach, noting that the aviator had made no attempt to pull out of his dive or bail out when his aircraft was clearly doomed, instead maintaining perfect control until the moment of impact. The deliberate nature of the attack was impossible to deny or rationalize as the desperate act of a panicked pilot, forcing Mark and his shipmates to confront the reality that they faced an enemy willing to embrace death as a standard military tactic. The psychological impact of witnessing intentional suicide attacks proved almost as devastating as the physical damage inflicted on American ships, as sailors struggled to understand and respond to tactics that violated every assumption about human behavior in combat situations. Mark wrote about the conversations that took place in the Franklin's mess halls and berthing areas as crews tried to process what they had seen, noting that many men seemed genuinely disturbed by evidence that their enemies valued death more than survival. The traditional comfort that came from believing that all combatants shared a basic desire to live through combat was shattered by kamikaze attacks, leaving American sailors psychologically unprepared for an enemy that treated death as victory rather than defeat. As kamikaze attacks became more frequent during late 1944 and early 1945, Mark began documenting the various defensive measures that Task Force 58 developed to counter suicide tactics, including expanded fighter patrols, improved radar coverage, and concentrated anti-aircraft fire patterns designed to destroy incoming suicide bombers before they could reach their targets. However, these conventional defensive measures proved only partially effective against pilots who were not trying to survive their attacks, as kamikaze aircraft could continue flying and maintain course even after suffering damage that would force conventional bombers to withdraw or abort their missions. The most disturbing aspect of kamikaze warfare, according to Mark's letters, was the way it transformed routine naval operations into psychological endurance tests, where American sailors had to maintain their sanity and effectiveness while knowing that enemy pilots were specifically seeking opportunities to kill themselves while destroying American ships. Every radar contact became a potential suicide attack, every distant aircraft a possible kamikaze, creating a state of constant tension that wore down even the most experienced combat veterans. Mark wrote about shipmates who had fought through 2 years of Pacific combat but now jumped at unexpected sounds or couldn't sleep because of recurring nightmares about diving enemy aircraft. The Franklin's first direct encounter with a coordinated kamikaze attack came on March 19, 1945, during operations off the Japanese home islands in support of the Okinawa invasion. Mark was in the forward magazine compartments when general quarters sounded at 0630 hours. Followed by reports of multiple bogies approaching the task force from several directions simultaneously. The attack that followed would test every defensive system aboard the Franklin and push her crew to the limits of human endurance, while providing Mark with a first-hand education in the true meaning of Japanese determination to resist American victory through any means necessary. March 19, 1945 dawned clear and calm in the waters off Japan. But the peaceful morning was shattered when radar operators detected the first wave of kamikaze aircraft approaching Task Force 58 from multiple directions in a coordinated attack designed to overwhelm American defensive systems through sheer numbers and determination. Mark was performing routine maintenance on ammunition handling equipment in the forward magazine when the ship's alarm system began wailing, followed by the familiar voice of the captain over the intercom announcing that the Franklin was under attack by suicide bombers approaching from the northwest at high speed. The next few hours would transform the massive aircraft carrier from a symbol of American naval power into a floating inferno where survival depended as much on luck as on skill. The first kamikaze to reach the Franklin was a Nakajima B-6N bomber that had somehow penetrated the defensive fighter screen and anti-aircraft fire to approach the carrier's starboard side at an altitude of less than 500 feet. Mark heard the distinctive sound of the ship's 5-inch guns firing in rapid succession, followed by the sharper crack of 40mm and 20mm weapons, as the kamikaze pilot pushed his aircraft through increasingly intense defensive fire without deviating from his attack course. The bomber struck the Franklin's flight deck near the island's superstructure, its 500-pound bomb and remaining fuel creating an explosion that killed dozens of sailors instantly and started fires that would eventually threaten the entire ship. Mark's position in the forward magazine compartments placed him at the center of the most dangerous area aboard any aircraft carrier under attack, surrounded by enough high explosives and propellant charges to destroy the entire ship if the fires spreading across the flight deck above managed to reach the ammunition storage areas. His training had prepared him for this possibility, and he immediately began implementing damage control procedures designed to flood the magazines if necessary, to prevent a catastrophic explosion that would kill everyone aboard. The irony was not lost on him that his survival now depended on the same Japanese pilot who had just sacrificed his life in an attempt to sink the Franklin and kill her entire crew. The second kamikaze attack came just minutes after the first, as another bomber approached the Franklin from a different angle while damage control parties were still fighting the fires caused by the initial impact. This aircraft, a Yokosuka D-4Y dive bomber, managed to penetrate even closer to the ship's vital areas before being shot down by defensive fire, crashing into the sea just yards from the carrier's hull. The near miss created a massive waterspout that drenched the flight deck and temporarily suppressed some of the fires, but the psychological effect on the crew was devastating, as they realized that only luck and the skill of their gunners had prevented a second direct hit that might have doomed the ship. Throughout the attack, Mark maintained radio contact with Damage Control Central while monitoring the magazine flooding systems and ammunition temperature gauges that would tell him whether the explosives around him were approaching the point of spontaneous detonation. His letter to his wife, written during a brief lull in the fighting, captured the surreal experience of performing technical duties while knowing that enemy pilots were actively trying to kill themselves in order to destroy his ship. He wrote about the concentration required to follow complex procedures while explosions shook the hull, and the constant awareness that each second might be his last if the fires above reached the magazine compartments where he worked. The most harrowing moment came when a third kamikaze, a Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter loaded with a 250-kilogram bomb, dove directly toward the Franklin's flight deck from an altitude of 8,000 feet in a near-vertical attack that gave defensive gunners only seconds to engage the target. Mark felt the ship heel sharply to starboard as the captain attempted an emergency turn to avoid the suicide bomber, but the Zero's pilot compensated for the evasive maneuver and struck the carrier's aft flight deck in an explosion that knocked out several gun positions and started additional fires that spread rapidly among parked aircraft. The impact was so violent that it threw Mark against the bulkhead of the magazine compartment, stunning him temporarily and filling his vision with stars as he struggled to maintain consciousness and continue his damage control duties. What do you think went through the minds of American sailors when they realized they were facing an enemy willing to die in order to kill them? And how do you believe such tactics affected the psychological well-being of both sides during the final phase of the Pacific War? The fires that raged across the USS Franklin's flight deck for the next 6 hours represented one of the most severe damage control challenges faced by any American warship during World War II, as the crew fought not only the immediate effects of kamikaze impacts but also the secondary explosions and spreading flames that threatened to consume the entire carrier. Mark found himself at the center of this struggle, using his technical knowledge of the ship's ammunition handling systems to prevent the catastrophic magazine explosion that would have killed everyone aboard and handed the Japanese a propaganda victory to match their tactical success. His letter described the methodical process of flooding critical magazine compartments, while maintaining enough ammunition flow to keep the ship's defensive guns operational against additional kamikaze attacks that continued throughout the day. The human cost of the Franklin's ordeal became apparent as Mark moved through the ship's lower decks during damage control operations, encountering wounded shipmates who had been caught in the initial explosions and sailors who had been overcome by smoke while fighting fires in the carrier's hangar decks. The ship's medical facilities were quickly overwhelmed by casualties, forcing corpsmen to establish aid stations in mess halls and storage compartments, while the most seriously wounded were evacuated to other ships in the task force when flight operations permitted. Mark wrote about carrying stretchers through smoke-filled passageways and helping to move wounded men to areas where they could receive proper medical attention, noting that many of the injuries were unlike anything he had seen during conventional combat operations. Perhaps most disturbing was the realization that the kamikaze attacks represented not desperate improvisation by a defeated enemy, but a systematic military strategy that Japanese commanders had embraced as their best hope of inflicting unacceptable casualties on American forces. Intelligence reports that reached the Franklin during the afternoon indicated that similar suicide attacks were being launched against other ships in Task Force 58, with enemy pilots specifically targeting aircraft carriers and other high-value vessels that represented the core of American naval power in the Pacific. The coordinated nature of these attacks suggested that Japanese military leaders had concluded that conventional tactics could no longer achieve their objectives and had turned to suicide warfare as a deliberate policy rather than an act of desperation. Mark's technical expertise proved crucial during the most critical phase of the damage control effort, When rising temperatures in several magazines, compartments approached the point where spontaneous explosion became likely despite flooding efforts. His knowledge of the Franklin's ammunition storage systems allowed him to isolate the most dangerous areas while maintaining access to the shells and powder charges needed by the ship's gun crews, who continued firing at incoming kamikaze aircraft even as fires raged around their positions. The delicate balance between preventing catastrophic explosion and maintaining defensive capability required split-second decisions that could mean the difference between survival and total destruction of the ship and her entire crew. The psychological transformation that occurred aboard the Franklin during and after the kamikaze attacks was as significant as the physical damage inflicted by enemy suicide bombers, as sailors who had survived the ordeal found themselves changed by their encounter with an enemy willing to embrace death as a weapon of war. Mark wrote about conversations with shipmates who expressed confusion and anger about tactics that seemed to violate basic human nature, noting that many men struggled to understand how their enemies could deliberately choose death over the possibility of survival and future combat effectiveness. The traditional military virtues of courage and determination were redefined when facing opponents who valued death more than victory in any conventional sense. As the Franklin limped away from the combat zone under escort by other Task Force 58 vessels, Mark began the process of documenting his experiences in the detailed letter that would eventually provide historians with unique insights into the human impact of kamikaze warfare on American naval personnel. His observations about the technical aspects of damage control under extreme conditions were valuable enough, but his emotional and psychological reflections captured something more important about the way suicide tactics affected not just individual sailors, but the entire American approach to naval warfare in the Pacific theater. The USS Franklin's journey back to the United States after surviving the kamikaze attacks off Japan represented both a triumph of seamanship and damage control, and a sobering reminder of the human cost of victory in the Pacific theater. Mark spent the 2-week voyage helping to repair battle damage while reflecting on his experiences in letters to his wife that revealed the profound psychological impact of facing an enemy that had weaponized death itself. The ship that limped into Pearl Harbor on April 3, 1945, bore little resemblance to the pristine aircraft carrier that had left California just months earlier. Her flight deck scarred by bomb craters and fire damage, her superstructure blackened by smoke, and her crew marked by experiences that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The casualty reports that emerged during the Franklin's transit to Hawaii told the story of kamikaze effectiveness in stark statistical terms that complemented Mark's personal observations about the human cost of suicide warfare. The carrier had suffered 724 killed and 265 wounded during the March 19th attack, making it one of the bloodiest single-day losses experienced by any American warship during the Pacific War. These numbers represented not just military statistics but individual tragedies that affected families and communities across the United States, each death a reminder that Japanese determination to resist invasion had found expression in tactics that maximized American casualties even when they could not prevent ultimate defeat. Mark's letters from this period revealed his struggle to process the moral and ethical implications of kamikaze warfare, particularly the way it challenged American assumptions about the nature of heroism and sacrifice in military combat. He wrote about his difficulty reconciling respect for enemy courage and determination with revulsion at tactics that seemed to glorify death over life, noting that traditional military virtues became complicated when displayed by opponents who actively sought their own destruction. The kamikaze pilots who had attacked the Franklin were undoubtedly brave and dedicated to their cause, but their willingness to die in order to kill others created a form of warfare that seemed to exist outside normal human understanding. The psychological counseling that the Navy provided to Franklin survivors was rudimentary by later standards, but it represented an early recognition that combat trauma extended beyond physical wounds to include emotional and spiritual damage that could persist long after bodies healed. Mark participated in group sessions where survivors shared their experiences and attempted to make sense of what they had witnessed. but he found that conventional therapeutic approaches seemed inadequate when dealing with the unique stresses created by kamikaze warfare. How could military psychiatrists help sailors cope with an enemy that had deliberately violated the basic human instinct for survival that underlied most assumptions about combat psychology? The homecoming that Mark experienced when the Franklin reached the Brooklyn Navy Yard in late April 1945 was bittersweet, as he reunited with his wife while carrying psychological burdens that he struggled to explain or share with civilians who had not experienced the intensity of Pacific combat. Catherine noticed immediately that her husband had changed during his deployment, not just in obvious ways like weight loss and physical fatigue, but in more subtle alterations of personality and outlook that suggested deeper trauma than he was willing to discuss. Mark's post-war letters revealed his difficulty adjusting to civilian life and his recurring nightmares about diving enemy aircraft, indicating that kamikaze attacks had left psychological scars that would never fully heal. Mark Sullivan was medically discharged from the Navy in September 1945 and returned to Boston, where he found work as a machinist in a factory that produced peacetime consumer goods rather than weapons of war. He married Catherine in a formal ceremony that had been postponed by his deployment, started a family, and apparently settled into the comfortable middle-class life that had motivated his original decision to join the military. But his family noticed that he never spoke about his wartime experiences except in the most general terms, and that he would become agitated whenever discussion turned to Japan or Pacific combat operations that appeared in movies or television programs. Lieutenant Mark Sullivan died in 1987 at the age of 68, having lived long enough to see the USS Franklin restored as a museum ship and memorial to the sailors who had fought against kamikaze attacks during the final phase of the Pacific War. His letter, discovered during the ship's restoration, was donated to the National Museum of World War II in New Orleans, where it serves as one of the most complete first-person accounts of what it felt like to be inside an American warship under suicide attack. The final paragraph of his letter, written while fires still raged above his battle station, captured both the immediate danger he faced and the larger significance of the Franklin's survival. "If we can get through this, maybe we can get through anything. The Japanese are throwing everything they have at us, including their own lives, but we're still floating and we're still fighting." Today, the story of the USS Franklin and her crew serves as a reminder that victory in the Pacific came at a cost that extended far beyond the official casualty figures, encompassing psychological trauma and moral complexity that continued to affect survivors for decades after the war ended. The kamikaze attacks that Mark survived represented not just a tactical challenge for American naval forces, but a fundamental test of American values and assumptions about the nature of warfare itself. The fact that Task Force 58 continued operating despite suicide attacks demonstrated the resilience and determination of American sailors. But it also revealed the true cost of victory against an enemy, willing to embrace death as the ultimate expression of resistance to foreign invasion. Did you know that kamikaze attacks against Task Force 58 during 1945 resulted in more American naval casualties than any other single tactical innovation of World War II, fundamentally changing how the U.S. Navy approached both combat operations and the psychological care of personnel who had experienced the unique trauma of suicide warfare?